Excellent. So welcome back to attendees in the room who've just enjoyed our delicious lunch.
No.
Our slides are slowly finding their way towards the screen. You can see them now, hopefully. And I'm going to hand over to our speakers. So Chris Holscher is here with us in the room. Chris has been working with our colleague Robin Schaffer, who is speaking online at the Analyst Observatory on the state of startups and scale-ups with the Industry Analysts Survey research for a few years now. We have just launched the 2024 data collection, which Chris will speak about. So I'm going to hand over to Chris and Robin now, just pausing to thank the sponsors of the study, obviously the University of Edinburgh Business School and our friends at AR Insights and at Spotlight. So Chris, thanks for sharing the research with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Duncan. I think I have something like 28 or so slides, so I'll try to go through them quickly, so there's a lot to talk about. So this is a bit of research that Robin and I have started because we found, as we're working with startups and scale-ups and investors and the ecosystem, that we can tell, lots of stories about successes and issues in this space, and startups and investors will listen and they will nod their heads and they will say, well, that's interesting, but that's what they really want and need, and rightfully so, is data. And there wasn't a lot of data, so we thought, let's dive into that and create that data. So we've launched this program together with the University of Edinburgh Business School, with the kind support of Professor Neil Pollock, I should say, and with their support also through their PhD students to keep us honest in our research and so on. So the program itself is performed by Robin Schaffer in the US and me in Hamburg, Germany, in Europe, and it's kind of a research program. It's not a one-off story. It's a research program that we want to conduct over many years, hopefully, on a biannual basis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on a future slide. But we have a very kind support, not just from the business school, but also from AR Insights and from Spotlight, at least for the 2022 study. They've been phenomenal intellectual sparring partners. They have helped us with outreach and promotion of the material, of course, and they provided the financial backgrounds to do this. However, what they did not do, they did not influence in any way, shape, or form the questions that we were asking or the concept of the study or so on, because they're themselves very interested in understanding about this playing field. Now, the research program is as I said, is a biannual survey that we are running, with 2022 being the first one that we launched, that we've done, 24 now being the second round, and that will hopefully continue. It's always 3 dimensions, the survey, so it's actually 3 different surveys every time we run this. One is specifically designed for startups, the other is specifically designed for the ecosystem of investors and accelerators, and the third one is tuned to analysts. And we bring all those together, the findings, to get a comprehensive 360-degree view of that playing field. And in that, what is really important is we're not just looking at startups or at investors who have actually worked with analysts, or who have extensive experience with that. No, we explicitly want to bring in the views and perspectives and expectations and frustrations and everything, also from those people who have no experience with industry analysts, because we want to capture the complete 360 degrees views. Again, in 2022, we did full circle foundational research that I'll go through today. And this year and in the years forward, we're amending fresh focus topics to kind of create a patchwork of understanding of everything that contributes to this playing field. We also do deep dive research with selected analysts on particular questions with the support of a company called Circlelytics. They have a phenomenal methodology there that allows to ask one question, then have all the responses and structure these responses by agreeing or being controversial or so, and the respondents can then see all those respondents and respond to the responses and say, this I agree with, this I strongly disagree with, and here's why. So you get that extra level of feedback to the research, which is incredibly insightful, and that has given us a lot of extra understanding. And to round things off, we also do deep dive interviews with those candidates that have given us the most interesting or controversial data and responses and comments. And we got a lot of this, so that was extremely useful. Now, some key findings of the first study in 2022. First of all, to give you a foundation, we got around about 500 responses with if we only look at the startup respondents, almost 80% had some kind of experience in working with analysts, either at a previous startup or at their current startup, or at both previous and current startups. But we were very proud to have even responses from 22% of people who had no exposure to analyst relations whatsoever so far. So that gives us material to bounce things off of both ends. Now, the first finding we had was that we looked at those respondents who hadn't worked with analysts or had very low or medium and then high maturity in their interactions with analysts. And we asked them, so how knowledgeable do you find analysts in their field? How trustworthy and how independent do you find them? And really interestingly, those who didn't work with analysts at all had relatively negative views on the concept of analyst relations, sometimes even with really harsh comments of, yeah, that's all pay to play, that's all, you cannot trust this, it's just one other voice in the market. But the more they actually worked with them, those curves went steeply up, and that was on a rating from 0 to 10, so nearing 8 points for trustworthiness the more they worked with analysts, actually. And that's really reassuring. Now, we then compared industry analyst motivation to work with startups to the startup view of working with analysts. And the first half of that question was, so why do you as an analyst actually work with startups? And some of the response possibilities were just to understand new offerings, to comprehensive view of the landscape, decide on vendors to track or even to recommend, or just to be a good citizen and support those adorable new entrepreneurs and things. And what I found really insightful is that this latter options of being very supportive of new entrepreneurs, yes, that does happen, but it's a 50-50 yay nay kind of response, whereas the other response options like understanding new offerings, that's 90% of the market. I mean, that's pretty obvious, of course, but if you go further down and you arrive at this identifying vendors to actually recommend, identifying real innovators they could recommend in buy-side inquiries or in investor inquiries, that's 80%. 8 in 10 analysts specifically speak to startups to identify those innovators they can put forward to investors or buyers. That is quite powerful, and we need to make that more visible in the market. The learning is startups do not get an advantage in the market. They this support entrepreneurs 50-50. They're not getting support because they are a startup. They're getting support if they're interesting and if they're doing a good job, and that's also a good thing. Now, if we look at startups' value expectation of working with industry analysts, it was interesting to see that it's really split into 3 kind of groups. And the top group of what they expect of value to get from analysts is kind of the outbound value. It's brand reputation, it's brand awareness, it's validation by investors. So they want to make sure they're well seen in the market. of identifying vendors to recommend to buyers is almost 80%. It's the complete opposite. So there's an enormous gap between startups and industry analysts in terms of what this is about and what they can expect from it and what kind of value they can really get. And we're out to close that gap. Now, let's look deeper into what actually is relevant for a startup to, why should they even, begin to talk to analysts? And we're separating out the views from industry analysts and that of startups, and it's relatively aligned, except for one outlier here, and that is revenue level. It's in the lower half here, but startups, or the other way around, the revenue level that a startup has achieved is not even half as relevant as startup believe in as compared to what industry analysts think. So first of all, it's much less relevant than anybody thought in overall, but it's not even half as relevant as even industry analysts think. So product maturity, on the other hand, is really the driving factor. It doesn't really matter how much revenue you make. It doesn't really matter how long you've been in the business or how far you've expanded or so. It's really your product maturity that should be the biggest driver for you to get going with analyst relations. So overall, we can also see that all the upper factors, the higher ranking factors, are all about your business story, whereas those tactical factors like revenue and time in business are more at the end. So don't worry too much about that. Now, then we ask, so at what point in the startup maturity journey, so we dig deeper into that maturity factor, at what point do you think you should actually start? Is it at minimal viable product stage, or at your beta stage, or at once you've achieved broad availability, or once you've even had a reference customer? And I got a question there from the audience the last time I presented. So where's the difference between a reference customer and a pilot customer? Because that is always thrown into the same bucket. Now, just very quickly, a pilot customer is someone who agrees to try your product and play with it and help you develop it, whereas a reference customer is someone who has agreed that without you being present, they would be open to being interviewed about their client experience. So that's an entirely different level of relationship maturity there. So just to clarify that. And what we found is that while startups have an overall expectation that leans towards the later end of that maturity cycle, that they would need broad availability or even reference customers as a prerequisite to reach out to analysts, to be relevant to analysts at all, analysts say, no. We want to hear from you much, much earlier. We want to hear from you even in beta stage, or 20% even thought once you've clarified your minimal viable product, because we're not here to celebrate you. We don't require broad availability. We don't require reference customers. We want to learn. And Duncan put it beautifully the other week in a small note that he had on LinkedIn, where you all know the bon mot of learn and earn. And Duncan put it this way, that he said, if you want to earn analyst advocacy, you have to help them to learn. So turning the learn around from I want to learn, yeah, that's a given, but I need to help them to learn, to earn their advocacy. And that's what this graph really is all about. It's you want to inform analysts as early as possible so they can learn, which forms the foundation of them at some point giving you advocacy and building that awareness with you. So that's a huge finding there. You need to start a lot earlier. And it's also a very good finding, because we all know that building analyst relations, you don't do this with one briefing. You don't do this at a snap of a finger or with a bunch of money. You do this over time. You build this up. You build credibility, you build belief, you build trust, you build that advocacy slowly. And the earlier you can begin, the better for you. Now, this really shows in the data, because we've asked startups, so at what point have you been covered by analysts at all? Have you been mentioned in any of their research, in social media, what have you? And roughly 60% of them said, yeah, we have been mentioned. 20-something% said no, we haven't, or we don't know, another 20%. So then we looked deeper into those 60% that had been covered within their first 10 years in business, so in startup phases. And the average, the mean age of when they have been covered by analysts was somewhere around 7 years in business, which is not too bad if you think of it as a startup coming from zero. That's quite okay-ish. And 29% overall, that's 50% of those that have been covered, were somewhere around 4 to 7 years they have been mentioned. But the incredible finding here is that almost 1 in 5 startups achieved actual analyst mentions within their first 3 years in business. Now consider that 50% of startups die within their first 4 years in business. That's, give and take, many studies in this field, but 50% die within their first 4 years in business in B2B. Now, if you are able to pull qualified brand amplification forward by about 4 years to something that you get mentioned within your first 3 years, that can mean literally a lifetime in a startup's world. So that can literally mean the difference between life and death. And Neil has had this phenomenal study looking at startup mentions in cool vendor reports, where we found that again, 50% die within their first 4 years. But if they get mentioned in a cool vendor report or in another reputable report of that type, of that quality, they suddenly have an 84% chance of survival and thriving. So turning from 50 to 84, and combine this with this finding here, that is sheer phenomenal. So what makes what would analysts really like to see in startup presenting themselves to them for the first time? So how can startups improve their introductory briefings? We asked, and we see that 2 things really stand out at the top. That's, first of all, please, less marketing speak, less beautiful language. Just strike out all the adjectives, basically. Forget about we're a leading provider, or we're super innovative, or those things. Leave those to the analysts. They're smart enough to figure that out. You don't. It's more about explaining yourself than celebrating yourself. Now, the second thing was just generally better quality briefings, and that speaks to alignment of the content to the analyst's research agenda and those kind of things, and don't having them too long and so on. It was a bit of a general point, but I think that's a really important insight. Now, looking at analysts' wish list for better briefings, because we had that as a on the previous slide is the second point up there with 56%. So what makes a better briefing? They want to really hear about, well, first and foremost, 90% about the product and the technology. I was a bit surprised by that. I would have thought that would be 100. But well, it comes out on top. Anyway, the next few lines there in terms of priorities are target audience and positioning, vision and mission, customer examples, and business strategy. Now, what really stood out here to me, and that's why I've highlighted it in pink, is this vision mission thing. Hardly any vendor that I've worked with really understood what a business vision and the mission really are. First of all, they get it completely wrong. Then they think it's the same thing, just with a different first letter, and it's just terrible. And my experience is that, especially with startups, or when you bring something innovative into the market, even as a large vendor, your ability to articulate what your vision in that market is and your mission of helping the market get there, if you're able to do this in a concise way, it sets the foundation for an analyst's understanding, literally fundamental understanding of why you exist, what you're there, what you're trying to achieve, what you're doing, and how you're contributing to this journey of that market. So it's really, really important. I was extremely pleased to see that come out as one of the top 3 points there. Yeah, we had one really interesting comment there on the right-hand side. You can read that. One analyst said, "We love the tech element, but you must go deeper into the business expertise. We need more critical business design thinking." So they really want to understand why the technology thing that you figured out, how that connects to actually creating a business. And not just making money, but to forming a well-oiled machine that can run with this thing and run efficiently and create money over time and scale, so that they need to understand. And so it's just more than saying, well, we have a fantastic product and that product is so much better than the other product. They're not just interested in that part. They really want to see ultimately the business that you're forming around that product, because only that will say you're a viable candidate for their research, because they have confidence that you will exist in 3 years' time, or in 5 years' time, or even 15 years' time. You maybe have been bought in the meantime, but that's a good thing as well. So they really need to see that business design around your technical product idea. So next phase, we asked into how startups manage their analyst relations. And of course, we had this number of 21% not working with IAs, IA as industry analysts, and almost 80% working with them. So it's a subset, and 41% of those 80, so roughly half, work with analysts through their C-level execs. And that was kind of, we have to be precise here. We really mean the analyst relations activity. Identifying analysts, scheduling briefings and inquiries, preparing those briefings and inquiry contents, and doing all the analyst relations practitioner work. So it's not just the briefing, not being a spokesperson, but actually setting up these things and orchestrating. So 41% left that to their C-level folks, which is incredible, because those guys, they have so much to do. They have a real capacity problem without this topic on their desk already. So I found it stunning that 41% of those who do it run through their C-level, and some 22% have an in-house AR competence, and another 22% do this via their marketing, and very few do it through products, and a stunning 14% do it on an ad hoc basis. Just whoever comes around at the wrong time, it's assigned to that person. So there is a lot of room for improvement here. 25% of all those who run analyst relations use additional external analyst relations support, people like Robin or myself, to help them doing those things. Now we asked the analysts on the other side. So if those are the people who run analyst relations at startups, how good is this? How effective is this actually in your work with them? And we found that when it goes through the C-level, it's somewhat 68% positive or very positive experience, and then it declines towards the strategy people. That's the next positive thing. Then marketing goes down to some 56%, and if it's done through products, it's just 54%. So just slightly positive. But that speaks again to this expectation of analysts, that they don't just want to have the technology perspective, they need the entire 360-degree picture. So with people who are great inventors, technical product people, they're typically not also great entrepreneurs. They're not great business developers. So that makes analyst relations typically less effective. And the most effective, of course, is that when you have analyst relations specialists running this thing, yay, very good news for us here. Also interesting to see, to take a look at the negative impacts here, ineffective or very ineffective, and that is the lowest when you have actual analyst relations people do this. Now, there's a lot more to say about the study, but the next bit here, we then ask, so how much are we actually spending? And 50% of the companies that we work with say, well, we don't invest anything at all. We just do briefings because briefings are free, or we follow the right analysts to take their publicly available information in and work with that. That's totally understandable. If you consider those are startups, they have minimal budgets, and so that's completely fine. However, of those 50%, that splits up into 21%, again, doing no AR, and 29% doing analyst relations, but with zero budget outside of their AR activities. So no subscriptions, all that, but they do spend capacity, at least, in running analyst relations as a function in their business. And then from there on going forward, we have 12% with a minimal budget AR, and then another 38% splitting up between 11 to 30K, 7%, 31 to 100K, 17%, and more than 100,000 US dollars per year budget that they invest in analyst relations, 14%. And bear in mind, we're talking with startups between 0 and 10 years in business, and we've made a hard cut at 10 years. So you can see a clear journey there from starting minimal viable analyst relations, as I call it, all the way through to selective and then being strategic analyst relations at some point. Now, we also asked, because we recognize that some people who had no exposure to analyst relations yet, or who just by the way of how we asked the question, probably realized, holy crap, there's probably more than we could do or should do, or we should do it in a better and more efficient way. So because of that, we asked them, so what are you planning for analyst relations next year? And on the startup side, 57% said, oh, we should do a lot more. We should be a lot smarter about what we do and how we do it. So that was quite an educational outcome of running that study, even while the people were just marking the boxes. Same thing with VCs and accelerators, though I have to be clear, we had relatively few responses there. So those 28%, those 63% that wanted to do a lot more, that was down to just a few responses. And interestingly, with industry analysts, 38% of them who already do this for a living for a long time, 33% say, well, if this is now gaining more understanding and startups know more about this playing field, how to do things well, maybe I should do more with them. And I can understand that because analysts are very pressed for time as well. They have very packed calendars, and their capacity is only, you cannot say, my day has 24 hours, and if that's not enough, I just add the night. That doesn't work very well. So they must prioritize one vendor over the other to take a briefing or run an inquiry or so. So there's very little space in what they can do. But 38% said, well, I might reprioritize my time to work more with those innovative vendors if they understand more about how this actually works. And that's a great finding. So that was 2022. That's already 2 years since. And now we're launching the next phase of the State of Startups with Industry Analysts. We've literally just kicked off the research last week with the analyst survey going live. And within just, I believe, 1 day, we had more than 50 responses to the analyst survey. So that's already 10% of what we had last time. So that's amazing, and we have high hopes there. And we've just launched the vendor and investor survey just yesterday. Literally on my way to the airport, I just clicked the button and say, well, now it's live. And so we'll look into how this now adds the next puzzle pieces to our research. So again, 2022, we had overall expectations and value and why and when to engage and organization and investment and all these ground laying things. That was the first puzzle piece. And now we're adding the next puzzle pieces. In the analyst version, it's very much about, there's more, but I don't want to reveal that now. But there's 2 data points that I can even talk about indicatively at the moment. So one was we asked analysts, so how much time have you actually spent in your industry? going back to that point, how knowledgeable are they actually, and how much do they understand about this field? And from the first 50 responses, we had almost 60% of analysts having spent more than 20 years in their industry, and going up to even more than 30 years, so real dinosaurs in that space, but very curious dinosaurs. I mean, those are the best. They, keep being curious. So that was one indicative finding so far. And the other is we also asked them, so have by the way, by any chance, have you worked with a startup throughout your career? And guess what? Another 60% actually have worked or are currently working as a side gig at a startup. And that speaks very much to their curiosity, to their mindset of challenging the status quo. That's why you are an analyst. You want to see where things are going. You're not so much interested in how things were. That's nice, when you have a beer in the pub at the end of the day, but it's really for their day job. It's really more interesting of where are things going. So they are very much into this space, even in practical today innovation work. So really reassuring. And on the vendor and investor side, we're focusing the questionnaire very much around the actual use cases now, not just general analyst engagement, but what kind of analyst offerings are you actually using? Where are you spending your time? And then what are you using it for? So the actual use case. And we talked about this earlier, that you can do so many things with analyst relations, and especially in a growing environment like a startup, you can apply it pretty much to everything you're doing. You can amplify the value of your best people, your best products, your best programs, your best projects and processes. You can, that's a lot of P's there, but you can bring that insight and that value into pretty much anything you do. So you have to be quite strategic about, because you have limited capacities, about, you need to be able to chew what you bite off. So be very strategic about how you're using them, at which point in your capacity, and also with the budget that you have available. So we're really looking into those use cases. We're also then asking, so in which analyst firms are you actually using? So we're not asking them to rate them or rank them, saying those are good, those are bad. We're not doing that at this point. We just want to know who are you working with, and also for which kind of analyst offerings are you using, which firms. So to get a better grip and understanding of who's actually present in that field of the market. And lastly, we want to dig deeper into this timeline, at which point throughout the startup maturity cycle, from pre-seed to seed stage to Series A, Series B, pre-IPO, and so on, at what point are you investing, how much, and what kinds of activities are you doing at which point in that journey? So we get a better time-related and maturity-related understanding of that. And that will be the yellow puzzle piece here of our understanding. And you'll see a few grayish ones there coming down on top. We have a lot of plans for the future. There's so much more to learn about this field, and I believe we can even circle back some of those learnings into the space of large firms, large enterprises. I think there's a lot to learn in that direction as well. Now, with that said, this 2024 version of the research is again kindly supported by the University of Edinburgh Business School with a super nice PhD student who helped us set this up and get the data right and get this set up in a way that keeps us honest, and also with the fine folks over at AR Insights who chose to help us out financially to make all this happen, because that takes a lot of time and effort, and money helps. So with that said, I'm at the end. Spread the word, make everybody know, invite not just startups to contribute, but reach out to any investors and ecosystem accelerators, so on, because those are the ones we really, really need the most. And I have kept the links to the 3 different surveys here at the bottom. So if we can share those as well, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
You talked about the percentage of respondents who had not worked with, or who hadn't worked with AR or worked with analysts, sorry, and who didn't feel that analysts were influential. Do you feel that those people maybe are mixing up the pay-to-play influencers and analysts?
Totally. We specifically asked them, so why? Why are you not working with them? And there was, I do have a slide here. Let's look into that slide. Must be here some, whoops. It's not the right thing.
Chris, while you're looking, I'll just chip in on one experience that Neil and I and our co-author Sue-Wen Chen had in an earlier round of data, where we were interviewing startups that had won that had been awarded the cool vendor designation by Gartner. Many of these firms were very happy to use the designation, but others felt that it was a little bit grimy because they had heard about gaining this designation through an interaction with an account manager who'd said, well, you'd won this, and so I invite you to spend some money with Gartner. And they did not realize that getting that designation, it is free, it is lifetime, there is no financial, it's a real award, it's a real benefit. But the fact that they heard about it through an interaction that invited them to spend money made them feel that. And actually, when I think of another project that Neil and I were involved in, which was the Analyst Launchpad, which was a joint venture with Tech UK, the body that represents tech firms here in the UK. We did workshops where we were training high-tech firms headquartered in the UK, not only British, but international subsidiaries. Many of them thought that analyst firms were pay to play, partly because if you're not doing analyst relations, if you're not proactively reaching out to analysts, the only people who will reach out to you, if you're a small firm, are the account managers. So then that's the only way, that's the only way that you meet them. Much like, the only way that I come across people from other religious designations is when they're shouting at me from outside a subway station. I imagine that all religious people just stand outside subway stations and shout at people, but apparently that's not the case. That's what I hear. But my experience is very limited, and I just find them to be shouting. So, Chris, you may have found your slide.
I have. Can you bring that on the screen again, or do I need to share actively again? Let's see. Hello.
Top right.
There you are.
Yeah.
Boom.
All right. Yeah, to the point that Duncan just made, startups are not experienced enough to differentiate between the analyst firm and the actual analyst. So when Gartner reaches out to them and said, would you like to become a client? They contact me and say, oh my God, an analyst has spoken to me. What do I do now? No, the salesperson of an analyst firm has spoken to you. Yeah. And to be honest, what I found over the last years is that, well, let's stick with the fine folks at Gartner. They are so good at sales. They're extremely good at
annoying, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Their process is so slick, is so streamlined, is so well thought through that they scare the hell out of people. They even experienced business people feel, holy moly, I don't have this under control. Where's my garlic? I need to, so and that's really a problem. Now, anyway, and that drives this, what I wanted to say, actually, that the second biggest point in why startups do not feel that they want to work with analysts is that pay-to-play notion. And they think it's too expensive and all that, because also because they're being approached by the sales folks of analyst firms, they feel like they need to have a subscription with them in order to enter the field. So they don't understand that they can totally do analyst relations in a very productive and very professional way without having a subscription.
We just bought a startup that when they came over, we said, have you been doing analyst relations? And they're like, yes, we have a lot of contacts. And they sent me a list of salespeople that they've been talking to.
Yeah.
And literally right before we signed, they signed all these contracts that they just expected we were going to pay. I'm like, we already have all of this.
Yeah.
But it was they'd been strong-armed into doing it because they've been talking with the salespeople.
Yeah. And then there's the second half of that. I'm digressing here a little bit from that thing, but the second half of that comes, a year later when they say, I'm paying so much at Forrester or at Gartner, and nothing has happened. I think I'll go there in person tomorrow and see what's going on. They expect that they have a subscription, and now magically something is going to happen. So it's like, I had this gym subscription for a year now. My belly is still there. Nothing's happened. I think I'll go there in person tomorrow and see what's going on at the gym and why nothing's happening.
Well, you are going to the gym in that case, at least.
Well, after a year for the first time. All right. The other reasons were, they thought it's too early. The ROI is unclear. They're just not familiar with it. They're too small. Those kind of things. All you would expect. Yeah, that's my notes.
Chris, what more surprised you from the findings, the 22 findings?
The clarity of the gap. What I presented very, very early on here, that 80% of analysts said, well, I specifically go there because my value as an analyst does not lie in knowing Oracle or knowing IBM. That's table stakes.
Yeah.
My value as an analyst is in knowing the ones that others don't know. So my value is in knowing who where the new gold is, and the unknown figures that might be great innovators, that might be great candidates for an acquisition, or if you want to do something differently in the market, or you have a specific need that the big guys cannot solve you, or you're frustrated with their products. Here are alternatives that are totally viable options that you might not have on the radar. And that's the extent that 80% of them said, specifically to identify those types of vendors. That was far more than I expected. I would have been, impressed if it would have been somewhere in the 30s. Yeah. But it's almost 80%. And on the other hand, startups' misconception of exposure to tech buyers or to investors only scoring here 27%. I thought that was a stunning underestimation of what's actually going on in the market. So, and that gap between the two fields, that I thought that was far closer, but it was actually much bigger than I even thought.
So you thought about introducing at some point the geographical angle to this, because I think the understanding or lack of understanding has got something to do with closeness to analyst firms. So if you're in Boston, again, you know quite a lot. Or if you're in Israel, as we saw in our research, you know quite a lot. If you're in Scotland, you know very little. If you're near Heathrow, near Gartner, you know quite a lot. So proximity actually seems to matter quite a bit, doesn't it?
I will just repeat that into the microphone because I'm not sure that has picked you up because so far. So the question was about whether we considered a regional or look into regional differences because in terms of the proximity of startups to analyst firms, if that might play a role. And yes, totally. Actually, that was my the initial thought that I had, because almost 10 years back, I looked at analyst relations job openings, and I was still with BT at the time. And I looked at which firms from which regions actually scored mentions in analyst reports. And I found an incredible difference between the US and Europe. So in terms of job openings, there were 30-1 job openings for analyst relations professionals in the US versus Europe. 30-1. I thought 3-1 would have been a lot. 30-1 is a different planet. And that brought me into looking at the differences in analyst report mentions based on geography. And with that, US firms outplay European headquartered firms by a factor of 4-1, which is still a lot because it literally means that hundreds of firms in a specific niche market are not even appearing on their market's most defining analyst research. So they're not even being considered by buyers. They're not visible at all. They don't play a role. Hundreds of firms. That's incredible. Now, if you look then into leader placements, it's even outclassed by 5 to 1, the US to Europe. So I thought there is a massive impact of where you're located and how aware you are of the fundamental concept of analyst relations in B2B technology and services, and your actual acting on this market and so on. So that was my original motivation to design this research. I put that back for a while because I thought, well, maybe I should dig into that after I've established the fundamentals of how the market actually works, and then I can go into regional differences. But that will for sure be one of the next research focuses, definitely.
Just on this point about distance, I mean, I'm reminded of two things. Firstly, again, thinking back to our cool vendor research, one of the things that we looked at is where are cool vendors? And I mean, okay, cool vendors are not the only way of seeing which startups are getting on the analyst radar, because that's just one vendor, that's just one analyst firm. But what we saw was that cool vendors are really geographically clustered in areas where where Gartner's account management is active, and where financing networks are well plugged into the United States. So, for example, there are more cool vendors in Israel than in Europe, for example, even though I think there's some high technology in Europe, maybe as much or maybe even more high technology in Europe than in Israel.
Isn't Europe also larger?
I hear that it is. Maybe it's just the maps, but I hear that it is larger. Yeah. And even more high tech than more in Israel than in China, than in Japan. I mean, in massive tech markets, and that is something about latency, and that about proximity, exactly. And then that reminds me of a German professor who used to be here in the business school and is now at King's College London, whose name I can't remember, but was Dirk or Jens, or he had a German name, weirdly enough, and he was doing work looking at financial regulations, financial regulators. And imagine if you were a bank and your regulator is here, very close to you, then you behave very, very well. You are much tidier, Whereas if you are here, if you are slightly further away, still quite close, but only slightly further away, outside the beltway, just one stop, at the end of the subway station in the same city, you're slightly less well regulated. You're slightly more likely to push the rules. Yeah? Whereas if you are away on the coast,
you're going bonkers.
You're going bonkers, and that explains that explains many things, right? I'm not sure what I mean. It's really indicative of a phenomenon that I feel is also found in the geographical spread of the United States, that it's very easy for firms in North America to get on the analyst's radar, and analysts are so much more present in North American markets that they're part of the conversation in the way that they are not, say, in the German.
It's a two-way street. On the one hand, it's of course analysts it's just easier to have people in your same time zone and who are around the corner, who you can go visit, who you can respond to, when they invite you to their product launch or something, their analyst day. It's just easier to take the subway than to take an intercontinental flight. So yeah, there's this element, but there's also the element of the vendors thinking, oh, this guy is so far away physically and mentally probably, that I don't really have it. It doesn't make a lot of sense because his customers will also be far away, so they might not even consider me. So it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if when we finally get to making that regional-based study, if that fundamental concept that we just discussed has maybe been softened a little bit through the positive effects of the pandemic. We're all just a Zoom call away from each other. So maybe, well, hopefully that has changed a little bit, but I'm super curious of the results of that research.
Yeah, I mean, you have enough data now to do that analysis. I'm prepared to bet something that you would want. I don't know what it would be, bet you a wristwatch or something, that that you'll see a huge, really huge geographical distance. The other thing that I think those of us who are analyst relations practitioners have seen is, for example, when you're presenting customer stories or customer references to analysts, proximity matters hugely in the value of these references. Yeah. So, you know, if you're providing IT to the British National Health Service, which is, you know, maybe the world's biggest employer, perhaps, or after the Chinese army, you know, that's a little bit less important than providing it to, you know, a mom and pop business in Stamford, Connecticut, who you walk past, you know, in the town center every day. And the way that like huge industrial brands, you know, I see it myself when clients put up that slide of logos that everybody has, you know, the logos that pick up the conversation are the North American B2B brands.
I'll agree with that in that, you know, it's one thing to be able to get into the Magic Quadrant or get the analyst's attention or something as a European brand, but you're still going to need that North America presence to be able to score well.
Yeah.
And I know that in a lot of interactions I've had with analysts, that, you know, we'll give them European references. They're like, okay, but what are you doing in North America? Give me the North America case study.
You know, actually, a great example of this, I hope none of my colleagues from Elisa are listening, but if I can give an example from Elisa where I'm working, if you look at the, you know, biggest telcos in the world and you divide their valuation by their revenues, Elisa is basically the most valuable telco in the world. Yeah. And that's because of extremely high levels of well, extremely efficient marketing, and very high levels of automation. And yet Finland is, I mean, that's right next to the North Pole, right? I mean, like Santa lives there. There's very little, like they don't even have an analyst relations function, right? I mean, it's a major multinational telecommunications practitioner, billions of dollars of revenue. They have so little analyst interest.
Yep.
You know, they don't even have an analyst. Now, how many North American firms with $2 billion of revenue don't have an analyst relations team, right? A little analyst relations empire, right? So if we were to look at how big are the firms, your startups, if we were to look at your startups and scale-ups, at what point do they start to do programmatic analyst relations? Now, I think it's before they get to 1 billion, let alone waiting until 2 billion.
Whoa, it's way earlier.
Precisely.
It's way earlier. Analyst relations is on pretty much every checklist when you get to Series A funding. It's just there. It's a tick box item. You've got to have analyst relations some way or another. And so that's when most startups then begin to think about that thing. They see AR, so what the hell's that? You know, and so figure out augmented reality. What are we doing with augmented reality? Let's say once and forever, AR has been analyst relations, even back when augmented reality was still considered a medical condition. So it's just for the record. However, so Series A, AR tick box, checkbox item in there to get the funding. If you only start then doing analyst relations, you have wasted years. You're years behind startups who, you know, as we saw by the data, have engaged with analysts when they had defined their minimal viable product and had their first connection points. It doesn't mean you have to invest heavily. It just means you have to interact, and interaction doesn't necessarily cost money. So you can keep them informed. You can interact with them every, you know, half a year, once or so, and maybe even more often when they say, well, that's interesting. I want to keep, you know, up to date from you. Not just every year or twice a year, but when you do your next step, just give me a call. And they do this. So you can gain so much advantage when you do analyst relations early and systematically from early on, so that when Series A arrives and you finally have big money to spend, you're already up and running at full speed, and you already have pre-established those connections. You already have brought all those insights into your product design, your wedge offerings, your go-to-market, and everything. You can then go really, you know, table on the table and go all in. So It's way earlier. It's way earlier than that, and that we need to teach people. I'm working with a tiny little consultancy firm in London, who, when I joined them, they were 14 people, and they were a very young startup. But the people working there, they're not in their 20s. They are experienced business people who knew a thing or two about their business. And they were lucky to have good contacts that told them, listen, guys, if you want to pull this off, you need to speak to an analyst relations professional early and get this into your system as best you can. And I know someone, and they recommended them to me. So we started working analyst relations very early on, and within 2 years, they've grown to over 80 people. They have ramped up their business value to now over 8 million, and they're literally receiving hundreds of project requests from folks like Amazon Web Services and stuff. So and they gradually grew their analyst engagement alongside the value that they brought into the system, which made them confident to take the next mini investment into buying a subscription. And then half a year later, they thought, oh, maybe it's worth doing that extra little bit of investment into the industries package of that Gartner subscription.
Yeah.
And then a little bit later, then thought it would make a whole lot of sense if we would add another seat for that subject matter expert whose personal value to our system, to our business, we can amplify through that seat. So go stepwise, go early, go systematically, go stepwise, and you'll just accelerate so much quicker.
Chris, I'm gonna wrap up this session now. I note that there were no questions from our observers. I think a lot of this is, well, it's a very comprehensive presentation, but please keep that do you have a URL of where people can download the report?
Yes, but it's the simplest thing is to go to holscher.one and then /SSIA, where they would just drop their email address, and then they can download the report for free or reach out to me on LinkedIn or something like that.